So once you have an idea about which foods you want to try and start food chaining first, let's go ahead and walk through some practical examples about how you could actually go about this while still maintaining a division of responsibility in feeding. To start with some small changes that you can begin to implement in order to get towards bigger success with food chaining, I'm going to go ahead and share just a few strategies that might be helpful. As mentioned, it is often easier for a child to receive changes to a food's shape or an item's color than it is to begin with changing their taste, their texture, or their temperature. So a few small changes I want to encourage you to do is to consider how you can remove packaging. And I have an example here as well as on the next slide. And that's so that you can kind of see how drastically different it is when we present something to our child in a known and recognizable wrapper versus in its actual form. A food that I thought might be a helpful example here is if you take a Larabar, for example. If your child knows that they only like the apple pie Larabar, chances are they would tell you they know they like the bar in the green wrapper. But if you were to take the food out of the wrapper and just hand it to your child as the food itself, they wouldn't necessarily know the apple bar from the pecan pie bar from a chocolate chip cookie dough Larabar. And so this can be a helpful visual for us as we begin to think if we could begin to remove the packaging, that slowly but surely removes or changes the color on them a little bit so they can see that, again, this is the same food. If you were to do this, I would begin to maybe buy that Larabar and that you know is the preferred flavor and remove it from the packaging and just start having the norm be that it's not served in the package. So then maybe as you do try one with a different taste or a different texture, they won't see this is visually so different. By that point, the visual cues will be the same and you'll be maintaining the same appearance of the food, but the taste will change with the different flavor that you introduce. And this might help you to expose your child to different flavors. Again, what's the significance of if your child likes one Larabar or every Larabar? A few things. One, flavor mapping. If your child loves apple pie, you could take this and transfer it to maybe other apple flavored products or apple products in general. Additionally, if you branch out, you might be able to start food chaining those different flavors to do additional flavor mapping to see, oh, my child really liked the lemon Larabar, or maybe did really like the pecan pie or chocolate chip cookie dough, and how you could food chain from each of those flavors that you see that your child shows preference for, or it gives you some information into the flavors your child maybe doesn't have preferences for. That would give you information as well that might not be a direction you want to take the food chain. For example, I know my daughter loves the chocolate chip cookie dough one, but she does not love the peanut butter one. So I know I could probably take more leverage with a chocolate chip type thing than a peanut based thing. This might seem kind of common and expected with a kid to prefer a chocolate chip versus a peanut, but again, that kind of information can give you a lot of insight into what your child might respond best to in terms of where you should begin building the chain, in which direction. So the first small change I would encourage is to remove that packaging and get your child used to that. Sometimes parents say that's the whole reason I'm buying it, is for the convenience of already having it ready to go. And so it can seem really wasteful to take something out of a package only to then have to put it into like another bag or something like that if you're eating it out on the go or sending it to preschool or something like that. So this, again, helps you leverage why prepackaged foods can be a limiting food in and of itself, because if you have to only have it in the package, you down the road might be able to make your own Larabars, which would be much less expensive and give you much more potential for nutritional variety and flavor differences and things like that, and maybe package them yourself in a reusable bag or something like that. For the initial phase, I would encourage you to just see it as part of the transition, not necessarily something that you're doing to promote waste. You know, try and find a reusable bag or something like that, or a familiar bowl or some other way that your child might respond well to it being served to them. Again, the same apple bar in this instance, but in another wrapper that takes away the more familiar colored wrapper that they identify this product with. Going back to an example from before, just to give another different example of a small change for big success with removing the packaging. Again, if the color and the shape of a product that your child prefers comes down to the packaging of one of their Love-It foods, you want to again think, is the difference in packaging alone already alerting your child to a difference? So sometimes it might not even be the food itself that's throwing your child off or indicating that there has been a small change made, but rather that they just see that there's a new package in their presence, and that tells them this is no longer the mac and cheese that I recognize. So as subtle of ways as possible that you can begin to remove packaging and discard it, and help your child to identify that, look, these noodles, for the image on the right, all these noodles and the cheese packets all look a lot more similar when you take away the box that they potentially could have come from. So again, just some visual examples to help you start thinking through how that might be something that could help you to begin to take that Love-It food, but remove the packaging so it's truly the food that they're beginning to identify with. So as you make changes to the food, that's where they're finding their comfort and their security in what the food itself looks like, not the packaging. Another small change that you can begin to make to get towards big success with food chaining is to play games at the store. And when you grocery shop with your child, it helps there to be no surprises. In the example of Larabars or mac and cheese shared on the previous slides, we can see that, if we're grocery shopping with our kid and we reach for a different flavor of Larabar than their preferred one, or we reach for a different box of mac and cheese than their preferred one, and we just remove it from the packaging and don't, enlighten them to this process and things like that, some kids might respond feeling like maybe some trust has been broken, or in feeling that they just don't respond well to the surprise. And so sometimes one of the ways that you can ease them into it is by grocery shopping with them and walking them through this process of how you're going to begin to try new foods and begin taste testing. And in the example shared before, maybe you take them out of the wrapper and you play a guessing game. Which one do we think is which? And maybe you smell it and you look at it and you kind of examine to see, do they look the same? What looks different about them? And then you taste them both and you can compare the flavors of them and things like that. There's ways to engage your child, but when we look at some of the ways that we can make small changes at the store, sometimes having your child involved in that process at the store can help empower them with some of that choice, so they see when that new product is within the home that they know that they had a role in helping choose which item came next. And so I don't know if any of you have ever played the game LCR. It basically stands for left, right, or center. It's a really fun, very simple game for families, and it's one that my family likes, but I like to think of it in the context of a grocery store. And if you're to narrow in on any one of the yogurts in this large, as all of us know, very large yogurt section that exists now in stores with so many different options, think of the one that you tend to buy most, and then think, how could you food chain that item very simply to buy one that's just a little bit different than the one you're currently buying. Again, this is just to add some variety and to add one link in the chain that gets us towards more gradual progress. And so I want you to think, how could you go left, right, or center, maybe up or down from the given item that you buy now? And that's going to be one of the most simple ways for you to begin to come up with a different one that's very similar. Most likely it's probably going to still be the same brand. It might just be a different flavor. And that's one way that you can just expose them to a slightly different one. And maybe you invite your kids to say, do you want one to the left? Do you want one to the right? Or do you want one up or down? Let's try a new flavor this week. Which one of these four sounds the best? So you can invite them, you can engage them, and you can have them take part in this process, so it becomes a little bit easier that then when you get home and they say, this is not my preferred blueberry yogurt, they know where and who had a part in choosing that other flavor. Sticking to the example of yogurt, I also want you to kind of think through maybe where your child is at versus where you as the parent and the nutritional gatekeeper hopes and sees your family going. So say, for example, right now your child loves Danimal yogurt drinks and you buy them in this packaging and they love them and this is what they always want and only want. You've maybe tried other alternatives of yogurt drinks and it hasn't gone well, and yet your goal is that they just eat plain yogurt with a spoon. As we break down all these differences that constitute a link in the food chain, we can see there's a lot of steps to get to something like, say, a very natural, plain, unsweetened yogurt versus a Danimals yogurt drink. And so that's going to likely take a lot of baby steps to get your child to this food. Again, it doesn't mean that you can't work towards this. That can be your end goal of a food chain, and you can continue to try and make steps in that direction. However, you might also need to see how you can integrate and include some other products that are more familiar stepping stones in the process towards integrating those other foods on the pathway towards a more nutrient-dense option. So with this, and again, the concept of playing left, right, center, you might see how Danimals is in a similar position on the yogurt rack as another brand's alternative products. And you may initially try and find one that you feel like might be a little bit more nutritionally dense, even though it's not necessarily the ideal of a plain, natural, unsweetened yogurt. You see how this fits in the food chain. So you start to familiarize your child with, this one comes in a different package. This one's a different color package. We were drinking a red yogurt drink, and now we drink a yogurt drink that's in a blue wrapper. And then you can maybe food chain from that item to one that comes in a pouch, or maybe one that does come in a bowl shape. And ultimately what we see with all of this, even if it is a pouch, maybe once they tolerate the pouch or even the yogurt drink, you could maybe pour it into a bowl or put it into a cup and make it into kind of your own yogurt drink that you drink with a straw instead of in the packaging. Again, packaging can be such an identifying factor for kids. They don't necessarily even know what the food looks like inside of the package because so much of their security and their comfort is wrapped up in what the package is. A lot of families often will complain that when a product changes their packaging, it can throw their child in for a major loop when it is the exact same product. The company simply just changed the packaging. And so we see with this how strong the ties are for children when they really just start to identify with and relate to the packaging more so than the food itself. And again, all of us often need prepackaged foods for certain applications in our life, but we also want to think how these could be potentially thwarting some of our progress in getting our children to eat more diverse foods and variety of foods because they're getting so honed in on a specific package. So if we're talking about how you could start with changing the most simple characteristics or qualifiers of a given food with the color or the shape, we know that with the packaging, we're changing, some of the colors that might be what our child identifies with or qualifies that given Love It food. But next, I would encourage you to consider how your child might be able to manipulate the shape of the food. Oftentimes, if we change the shape and offer our child that food, again, it can come as a bit of a surprise, similar to if we buy a new product and do our own little version of left, right, center by ourselves at the store. It can sometimes come across as a surprise for your child when you then present your child with that new product you purchased. The same could be true of this, as we talked about before in the last module, with if our children can understand very complex neural pathways and understand an apple is an apple is an apple. Sometimes if we just present them with a different form of apple, they won't take to it. However, if we use simple household tools, whether it be like a kid-safe knife or maybe an apple slicer that you already have at home that has the apple core mechanism in it, or it might be more novel items. Say you decide to buy some specialty cookie cutters that can puncture through more firm textures like an apple that I have saved on my Amazon shop and I'll include as a resource as well on the module. Or items like this apple spiralizer. It's one of my kids' favorite products, and that's just another way to change the shape that an apple is being used. So you can use really simple tools that you might have, or invest in some more specialty tools if that's something that you feel like would fit for your family. But the goal here really is to encourage our children to be the ones to manipulate the shape. Again, when they feel empowered and they feel a part of the decision and a part of the process, they often can be more receptive to what these changes are, particularly when they see the starting place. They see the Love It food and all its qualifiers in the ways that they already qualify it as a Love It food, and then they get to slowly be able to manipulate the shape into a new form, and yet in a way that is also still comfortable for them. Something that we touched on before that can also be a helpful thing to just integrate into your routine is a surprise snack. And this might be a time during the week or one snack a week that you, as the parent, pre-plan having something like this Linking to Learn remix that we discussed earlier on. It might be one where, whether you're working with a feeding therapist or coming up with a more in-depth food chain on your own, you can begin to kind of set this up and think through how you want to have this as an intentional snack time, that maybe you set 20 minutes aside to have the snack with your child and help to walk them through and connect the dots between each of these foods on this given food chain. But if you have it a part of your routine snack schedule where maybe say on Thursdays you have a little bit more wiggle room and a little bit more time and flexibility to invest in sitting there and having a snack with your child, that might be something that you commit to your family's schedule as something that just becomes built into your week and offers you some opportunity that, one, you can be thinking about over the course of the week in terms of what might work, and teeing it up for your child so that they're excited about it and that they know this is a fun opportunity that you guys are going to get to do each week to just explore new foods. Another thing you can do for the surprise snack, which was mentioned before as one of the techniques of food chaining from the food chaining book, is something that's like a novel treat, something that doesn't necessarily fall in the food chain. And this does not need to be a treat. This doesn't need to be a dessert. I'm just sharing an example from my own life that I thought might be kind of helpful. And that's something like a date I go on with my 6-year-old. Every week we kind of pick a new spot, and sometimes it's a food spot, and sometimes I bring us snacks and we go somewhere that doesn't have food, like a park or the library or something like that. But this one particular day we went to the coffee shop and I let her pick something out of the glass case, and she chose a chocolate croissant. She'd never had something like this before. It was not at all familiar, but that's what she chose. And it was such a novel surprise snack because it was kind of like, well, she doesn't know what this is. And with apprehensive eaters, that can often, as we all know, be a barrier to them wanting to try new things. But when it becomes an opportunity for them to kind of start exploring a new food and trying something that's just very novel and reaffirms the joy and pleasure that can come from food, but particularly the joy and pleasure that can come from even new foods, can be a really reassuring and rewarding experience for your kid. So with this example, it gave my daughter and I a chance to talk through how we could make these. We even looked up YouTube videos. Of course, the ones at the coffee shop looked much more professionally done, but we found an example such as the image shown where we looked up, how do you even make these? And is this something that we could make at home? And I wonder if we made it at home like this, are there other ways we could make this food at home? Could we make it without chocolate? That would just be a normal croissant that we could have with dinner. And in my head, I'm thinking that could be a new Love It food that we could pair alongside other family meals. We don't normally do croissants, but we could, especially to get a little bit of variety in there. We could also maybe put cheese in the middle and see how they do that. That would be changing the taste and the texture, but it would be in a vehicle that she already has learned to prefer. And getting her involved in the process of seeing a YouTube video on how they're made and things like that, again, helps incorporate her in this process, as we talked about with surprise snacks, which sometimes can be a helpful means where if she and I were to do another surprise snack with this, she could be involved in the process and she could manipulate the different ingredients and understand a little bit more about what goes into this food and things as part of the process. And then if she wanted to eat it, great. If she chooses not to, it's still not at all a loss. Other things we got to talk about were experiences of when I had been to Switzerland and when I had my first chocolate croissant, and how fun it was to learn about foods from all over the world and the conversations that this type of special snack can elicit that you may not otherwise think to talk about with your child, particularly if you're kind of stuck in a rut and feeding the same foods every day. But again, to take this food chaining in a direction that you see your child lead. I would not have really thought to even introduce my child to a croissant because it's not a food necessarily that we have often in the home. But as soon as we have an opportunity and she leads and she shows an interest in a food that isn't particularly one of my objective foods on a food chain, but we can quickly see how it opens up a world of opportunity to engage with our children about food, teach them about foods of different cultures, get them involved in the kitchen, find new recipes that maybe are of interest to them. I can get her doing a lot of different recipes that I think are wonderful and I see as nutrient dense and things like that. But if she doesn't have an interest in it, we're not necessarily going to make the same gains. And so if you can begin food chaining some of these surprise snacks that go over well to invite new combinations and new variations of those foods, you can continue to see ongoing adaptability and willingness to eat and enjoy new foods, which again ultimately all drives back to the purpose of building a more robust Love It list and ultimately a more nutrient dense diet as we can get more and more variety in with what our children eat. As we talk about how often to food chain, I really want to encourage you that small changes can lend to big success. And again, this is not something where I'm not encouraging at all actually to food chain all of your children's Love It foods from the get-go. Again, choose one of the least nutrient dense options that maybe they're leaning on the least amount for their diet, and maybe change just a couple of them a week and see how they respond to it, so that you can see week after week, month after month, you're continuing to see not only new Love It foods added, but just a newfound willingness to try new variations and to have a more fluid relationship with the different types of foods that they're willing to eat, and see some of that rigidity that we talked about earlier in the module start to fade. And so one of the ways that I saw a need for this needing to be happened is that it's so easy to get in a food rut. You know, we start to rely on our staples, as all of us know, and those Love It foods, and we get so specific with the ways that we offer it that we need to start thinking about how can we make those staples that we're offering a little bit different as often as we can. And so as shared with the waffle combination card before from the breakfast deck, and then here with a basic staple like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which might be a common Love It food for some kids, rather than offering it the same bread, the same peanut butter, the same jelly, the same way that we, cut it up every week, we can see that we can make small, subtle changes to change the shape and the color and the taste and the texture and the temperature each week. And on the back of the combination cards, it gives different examples for this meal as a whole, but you can see different things like changing up the bread, or changing up the shape that you cut it in, or changing the taste with different variations of nut butter, and whether it be a jelly or a honey or a smashed fruit or something like that. There's just endless different ways to go about this. But the reason I wanted to highlight this is because it doesn't necessarily need to be a added burden to your week. Everyone already has so much going on and so much to think about that as you begin to work through this, I want to instead encourage you, how could you do what you're already doing and just do it just a little bit different? And so if you know you are packing a peanut butter and jelly every single day in your child's lunchbox, or maybe a sun butter and jelly might be a little more appropriate of an example here, think about how could you make it a little bit different for them. Again, you might want to be inviting them in this process, particularly if you're sending it to school. We don't necessarily want surprises in the lunchbox for our kids, but as your child gets used to this process of and used to you presenting foods that they prefer, but in new ways, then you can begin to take the liberty to change up some of these things so that you continue to offer them things that are presented in a different way, so that ultimately they'll begin to accept such foods in different ways as they're presented, at school, if they're buying lunch, or at a friend's house, if they're eating over there, or in different social situations, and just the eating competence that can come with that when making these small changes becomes just a normal part of the routine and the feeding environment that your family does. So I've shared 5 different small changes I think that you could start making as you begin food chaining to hopefully help perpetuate your family towards big success. And now it's your turn. Now with this week of homework, I want you to use the qualifiers list by category that you did with Module 5, and I want you to begin to plug that into the Food Chaining Next Steps worksheet that's in the Academy Notebook, and to begin brainstorming how can you change the color, the shape, the taste, the texture, or the temperature of your child's Love It food, making 1 or 2 changes at a time, again, starting really small and really slow if you're unsure how your child respond, and building off of that moving forward. And maybe at first you only do step 1 for the food and you just take that first step towards changing it. I know, especially when you feel like you're walking on eggshells, it can be really hard even to make just one change to that food because we get worried that our child might not respond well. But again, when you make these changes, what we want to be seeing you do is offer it with another Love It food if you can. So we'll just stick with the example of peanut butter and jelly that we just shared. If peanut butter and jelly is a Love It food and you're going to make a change to it, we want to no longer assume that it's a Love It food until we see that they have accepted that food chain. So if your child has, say, strawberries as another Love It food, I would include another Love It food alongside the food that you're food chaining, whether it be at a meal or a snack, so that they do always have a preferred food in a preferred form at that given eating opportunity in the case they reject the way that it's been food chained. And then from there, if you start to see that they're struggling with that, you may adapt how you take step 2 to move forward based off of, if you need to make smaller or more subtle changes to step 1 or how to best respond to that. So I've shared 5 different small changes I think that you could start making as you begin food chaining to hopefully help perpetuate your family towards big success. And now it's your turn. Now with this week of homework, I want you to use the qualifiers list by category that you did with Module 5, and I want you to begin to plug that into the Food Chaining Next Steps worksheet that's in the Academy Notebook, and to begin brainstorming how can you change the color, the shape, the taste, the texture, or the temperature of your child's Love It food, making 1 or 2 changes at a time, again, starting really small and really slow if you're unsure how your child respond, and building off of that moving forward. And maybe at first you only do step 1 for the food and you just take that first step towards changing it. I know, especially when you feel like you're walking on eggshells, it can be really hard even to make just one change to that food because we get worried that our child might not respond well. But again, when you make these changes, what we want to be seeing you do is offer it with another Love It food if you can. So we'll just stick with the example of peanut butter and jelly that we just shared. If peanut butter and jelly is a Love It food and you're going to make a change to it, we want to no longer assume that it's a Love It food until we see that they have accepted that food chain. So if your child has, say, strawberries as another Love It food, I would include another Love It food alongside the food that you're food chaining, whether it be at a meal or a snack, so that they do always have a preferred food in a preferred form at that given eating opportunity in the case they reject the way that it's been food chained. And then from there, if you start to see that they're struggling with that, you may adapt how you take step 2 to move forward based off of, if you need to make smaller or more subtle changes to step 1 or how to best respond to that. Once you've brainstormed and begun to thought through actually going about this and taking that first step to food chain, I want to go ahead and review a little bit further some of the ways that you can go ahead and implement this method to hopefully be most successful with those small changes. Again, as mentioned, you want to consider this a learning it food until you have seen your child accept it and enjoy it. And again, these resources for the Dr. Yum scorecard or the Love It Like It Learning It taste test card may help give you a more quantitative understanding of how your child feels towards this food. But oftentimes as parents, we can see just based off our child's enthusiasm towards a food, if they really, really enjoyed it and likely loved this new option, or if they were still a little bit more timid and chances are didn't like it. So you by no means have to use a taste test card or kind of a ranking scorecard if you don't want to. If it's not something that your child responds well to or is interested in, you can also just go based off observation. But we do want to make sure that when we're starting that we're not, say, only offering, in the example of the PB&J, if that is the only Love It food in the lunchbox, I wouldn't go so far as to change that only Love It food. Again, we want to be very careful. If a peanut butter and jelly is one of our child's staples for their diet and where they get the bulk of their nutrition right now and have a PB&J every day for lunch, that is not where I would start. That's simply an example to show you how you can begin to build it into a routine like serving PB&Js every day. So I would start with a food that is less key and less important to your child's diet right now, and then begin to make some of those changes. But in the case of the lunchbox, if you know that there's not other highly preferred foods in the lunchbox, I would go ahead and make that be a change that you're trying at home when there's other preferred foods available, or making sure that you're sending that lunch alongside other options if you choose to be food chaining this when your child's not at home. Some of the reasons why it can be helpful to be doing some of this food chaining. Again, we're not doing this to every Love It food, and we're also not doing this to every meal of every day. So when you're only choosing a couple Love It foods to be targeting each week throughout the week, I do encourage, when you can, to be doing them at home, whether it's just a breakfast, lunch, or dinner that your child is eating at home during the week or on the weekend, or whether it is one of those special snacks that we talked about that you kind of orchestrate as an intentional time to address food chaining. I would encourage you to be as present as you can, rather than, say, taking the leap to just send something in the lunchbox and wondering how it goes over, because understandably parent worry can kind of take over there when we don't necessarily know how they'll respond, what dynamics played into how they responded to it. Was it really the food, or was it something else that maybe was less within their control due to the food environments of school or preschool or things like that? So instead, I want you to consider that if your child didn't accept it the first time, how do you want to respond? Again, we're not going to shut down, we're not going to pressure and bribe. We don't need to be forcing these foods upon our kids at all. Instead, we want to think, did we make too big of a leap? Were we changing too many qualifiers at a time? If you did make as small of a change as possible and they still didn't accept it, then I want you to begin to kind of leverage that inner detective in your child to address all the qualifiers that you already know that they know about the foods that they love, and then to begin comparing and contrasting. And as mentioned, coming alongside them to identify what are some of the differences, or how did you know this was different? And if you want to get a magnifying glass, you're welcome to. Again, the objective initially is not necessarily for them to actually consume this food. Of course, ultimately that's the goal, but at first kids might feel more empowered to know that they're allowed to identify and be detective and do detective work towards this food, rather than feel the pressure that they need to eat it. And so you could help them to examine it a little differently in a more positive light by coming alongside them and helping them to compare and contrast what qualifiers they're seeing or tasting or recognizing are maybe a little bit different. And then to continue to present that food and offer that food chained food, so they continue to grow more familiar with that new form of it. If your child does accept the food chain, which is obviously our ideal goal, which will come with different food chains at different stages, I want you to celebrate. I want you to realize that's wonderful, because you've added a new like it or love it food. Again, depending on how enthusiastic your child was towards that food, will help guide you in the future of kind of where you might want to rank this food in terms of your love it, like it, learning it list. But this is great, and this shows us that you're heading in the right direction with this food chain, because that was something your child was receptive to. So again, you don't have to plug it into the qualifiers list every time, but in mentally kind of thinking through, what was it about this food that I think my child responded well to? What was it about this food that I think my child enjoys? Again, knowing that children eat the foods that they enjoy, we want to be in tune with what those foods are that they enjoy, so that we can continue to leverage those love it foods to gradually and progressively add in more like it foods over time. To wrap up Module 6, I want to go ahead and address something about the process that you are on with the Academy. I know that some of you might be asking at this point, doesn't this just get my child to eat more yogurt than they already are, or more crackers than they already are, or more mac and cheese than they already are? Or how does trying this new mac and cheese or this new hot dog really get us to our goal of branching out and getting them to eat meat and vegetables? And I just want you to know that I understand, and I hear you, and I'm with you 110%. But if you can just hang with me, because in this module, we are reviewing our starting place with what is working, so that we can graduate to new variations of these existing combinations that we know our children eat. We're working with the starting place of Love It foods in order to food chain to expand their diet to the most likely next step foods, which might be the like it foods, the variations of the love it foods, the foods that have a different qualifier to the given love it foods right now that we can begin to work through and expand the diet in. In the upcoming module, in Module 7, we will be doing the opposite. We'll be starting at the other side of the Love It, Like It, Learning It list, at the end point, at that list of all the Learning It foods, and we'll begin to work backwards to evaluate how we can help our child systematically tolerate these foods that they have zero preference for at this point, and how they can tolerate that more and more so that they eventually learn to like these foods. Again, getting to that like it or potentially even love it category. So our starting places are different between this module and the next, but I want to encourage you how all of them harmonize together to help us best support our child depending on where a certain food falls or how our child responds to a given food. So continue to hang in there and work through the steps as you're able.